My name is Braithwaite. I'm Associate Professor and Coordinator of Women's Studies at UPEI, and this is my book, Rethinking Women's and Gender Studies, co-edited with Catherine Orr and Diane Lichtenstein, both of Beloit College, Wisconsin.
Tell me what Rethinking Women and Gender Studies, what does that mean?
Okay, so what happens is any discipline, any academic discipline has a set of key terms or core language that's just the way that you do the discipline, right? So I'll think of something like psychology, for instance, uses the term the self, right? And it's just, this is an unproblematic term, everyone kind of uses this term. So women's and gender studies is no different. And so what we did was identify 18 of these sort of key terms and concepts in the field and invited 18 different people, the three of us and 15 others, to write essays around one of those terms, looking at what are the sort of histories of these terms, or what are their genealogies, what kinds of versions of the field are embedded in these terms, and what gets left out when these terms become taken for granted in particular ways.
Can you give me an example, like, of one of these terms?
Sure. I mean, the very first one in the book is the term feminism. Right, so I mean, and that's probably one of the biggest ones that people think about. Women's and gender studies as feminist, and what the author in that essay does is ask questions about what's the function of that term in upholding a particular idea about women's and gender studies as an academic discipline. What versions of feminisms get sort of trotted out and circulated in the field, and actually she ends up saying it's just one of many possible terms, one of many possible theoretical languages that can be used, that is used in this field.
So tell me where the contributors come from in this.
They're from all over Canada and the States. I think we have 5 or 6, I forget offhand, Canadian contributors, and the rest are U.S. I obviously am Canadian, and I've working on this book with two American co-editors at the same college who I've met at conferences along the way. One of them has become my co-editor and my co-author on almost everything that I'm working on these days. And then this is the result of a conversation that a number of us were having at conferences and online and so forth. And then all so most of these people are well known to me or to one of the other editors. And then in a couple of cases, we had one of our contributors knew somebody who they thought would also be perfect to write an essay, based on, or thinking about one of the other key terms that we'd identified. So for the most part, this really is kind of, we're calling it an in project, that people really do know each other, and that this reflects a kind of conversation that a lot of us have been having with each other in various ways, in various venues over the last few years.
Tell me about the timing of this conversation. Why is this what's being discussed now?
Well, for a number of reasons. I mean, women's and gender studies is undergoing a lot of changes. For instance, just its name, right? I mean, we opted to call it women's and gender studies because many programs and departments are changing their names at various universities for all sorts of reasons. And this is the most common way people are changing their names. We're going to change it differently at UPEI, but it's also, women's and gender studies has always been about knowledge, right? I mean, from the time it first moved into the university, it's been about how do we know something, right? Through what kinds of perspectives do we know something? And so it makes complete sense to turn that sort of gaze, that questioning about knowledge, back onto our own discipline. So women's and gender studies is one of its defining features is that it's really self-reflexive. So that conversation has been a really important one. That kind of self-reflexivity has been a really important one, and this conversation grows out of that process of being self-reflective about ourselves.
Tell me about your contribution, your written contribution in this
Sure.
book.
So, I mean, I co-wrote the introduction and, did all that editing work, but I also wrote the essay called Discipline. And one of the things that this field has, it's always said we are interdisciplinary, we are not a discipline. But I think that there are some real consequences to sort of maintaining, first of all, that distinction between the discipline and interdiscipline or interdisciplinary. And so one of the things I do in this essay is I sort of go back and look at a bunch of literature about histories of disciplines and just kind of unpack the idea that there is a distinction between disciplines and interdisciplinarity, and just kind of dismiss those words completely in some ways. And then I look at a couple of key moments in the last 10-15 years of articles and essays where somebody has either made the point that we aren't a discipline, that we are interdisciplinary, and I've asked, what are the consequences of making that kind of a statement? And I think there are all kinds of consequences that are both intellectual and institutional. And then I'll just let you go off and read it yourself.
Well, that sounds like a great place to end it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.